Colonel Burl Tuttle had sold the house, the shed and the milk barn empty by 2:30, and the last lot on his bill sheet was not in any of them. It lay a quarter-mile downhill out in the wet pasture, where it had lain for 14 years, 80 feet of riveted iron on stacks of oak cribbing, standing 18 feet tall at the end frame, rust orange from the top chord down to the bearing shoes. The bill sheet said, Lot 63, Iron Bridge as it lies. Tuttle walked better than 200 people down the hill through the grass to sell it, and it took him 4 minutes to find a bidder. Emmett Sill bought it for $45, and before he had his hand back down, the laughing had started behind him. It was the 12th of May, 1962, on the Wenzel Kolb place, 2 miles south of Wexford Mills, Wisconsin, in Tolliver County. Dairy country. Black and white cows on green hills, a creamery on the rail siding, 100 farms shipping cans into it every morning, and not much else. Wenzel Kolb had been buried in March at 81 years of age, and the nearest family was a niece in Rockford who wanted the whole thing over in one Saturday. So the niece hired Tuttle, and Tuttle sold all of it, the 2 tractors, the manure spreader, the 14 heifers, the parlor organ, 200 jars of home canning, and, because it was standing on Kolb's grass and named on the inventory, the bridge. Kolb had bought it himself in 1948 from Tolliver County for $110. The county had put a concrete slab across Pigeon Creek on the Dorrance Crossing Road that spring and had no use for the iron span it replaced, so they sold it where it stood and told the buyer to get it gone. Kolb got it gone with 2 crawler tractors, 100 feet of chain and 6 oak rollers, and it took him and 4 neighbors 11 days to skid it 3/4 of a mile uphill into his own pasture. He meant to set it across the creek for his cattle. He never did. It lay there on its cribbing through 14 winters while the grass grew up through the floor beams and a pair of barn owls took up in the portal bracing. That was the thing Burl Tuttle was trying to sell at the end of a long afternoon, and the crowd was enjoying watching him try. There was a scrap dealer down from Rennick that day named Merrill Dutcher, a heavy man of 51 in a mustard-tan sport coat and a bolo tie, who bought iron by the ton and had a voice built for a barn. Tuttle asked him for a bid to start it, the way an auctioneer does when he wants to make a thing look wanted. Dutcher gave the crowd its verdict instead. $6 a ton at my gate, he said, and it'll cost you $200 to get it to my gate. So I'll give you nothing, Burl, and I'll be doing the estate a favor. The crowd liked that, and he was not wrong. Either riveted iron is a nuisance in a scrapyard. You cannot shear it, you have to torch every joint by hand, and the mills discount it when it comes in. There were 3 other dealers standing in that pasture. Men who bought threshing machines and silo hoops and anything else with weight to it, and not one of them lifted a finger. Then Emmett Sill said $45. Emmett was 54. He milked 41 cows on 180 acres on the far side of Pigeon Creek, wore faded blue denim bib overalls and a straw hat gone the color of a feed sack, and had never bought anything at an auction in his life that anybody envied. Tuttle looked at him for about a second and a half, said sold fast, before the man could reconsider, and the pasture came apart laughing. He was not buying a bridge. He was buying floor beams. His herd crossed Pigeon Creek twice a day, morning and night, at a gravel shallows below the barn. And the high water in the spring of 1961 had taken the gravel out and left mud. In April, a good cow had gone down in it, and it took 3 men, a rope, and most of an afternoon to get her up, and she never came right after. What Emmett needed was a crossing 24 feet long that would carry 41 cows and a tractor and not wash out. And under the rotted deck of that bridge were rolled iron floor beams and stringers in exactly that length, and he had been looking at them from the road twice a week for 14 years. He wanted about 3 tons of iron. The only way to buy 3 tons was to buy all 30. Adeline heard the story at supper the way she heard most of his stories, which is to say afterward. She was 51, she kept the milk records and the bank book in the same drawer, and she asked 2 questions. How much of it do you need? About 1/10, he said. And what will you do with the other 9/10? He said he would think about that. If you've made it this far into Emmett's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The estate wanted the pasture cleared by the 1st of July, which gave him 7 weeks, and the first 3 of them taught him what 30 tons actually means. He borrowed a crawler tractor from Herb Rausch and a cutting rig from the implement dealer and went at the span the only way one man can go at a bridge, which is a joint at a time. Riveted work does not come apart. Every connection is 30 or 40 rivets driven hot in 1908 and shrunk tight as they cooled, and there is no unbolting any of it. You burn the heads off, you drive the shanks through with a punch, and when that fails, you cut the member in half and deal with the pieces. He went through 22 tanks of oxygen. He burned the sleeve off one arm and the hair off both. The top cord came down in 4 pieces on the second Saturday, and it came down wrong, and one end of it dropped 8 feet into the sod with a sound they heard at the creamery. That got in the county paper. There was a photograph of Emmett standing beside it with his hat off, and some clever person at the desk in Wexford Mills captioned it, "Bridge to Nowhere." And that was the name of the thing for the next 5 months. There was a permit to get as well, because 80 feet of bridge does not travel 2 miles of county blacktop in one piece, and even the pieces were oversized. Orville Pike, the sheriff, drove ahead of the first 3 loads with his arm out the window and an expression he did not bother to hide. And on the 4th load, a cord section overhung the wagon far enough to take out a mailbox and 40 feet of Herb Rausch's fence, which Emmett put back on a Sunday at his own expense while Rausch stood in the ditch and told him what a bridge was worth. He hauled it 2 miles to his own place on a hay wagon and a borrowed flatbed, 22 loads over 5 weeks, and stacked it in 3 long rows in the lot beside the machine shed. Iron in a farm lot looks bigger than iron on a bridge. From the road it looked like a wreck. Neighbors who had never once turned into his lane found reasons to turn in. And then he ran out of summer. The crossing needed 2 concrete abutments, and abutments needed forms, gravel, and about $300 of cement he did not have in June. Because in June a dairy farmer has hay down. Then it was second crop. Then it was silo filling. The 3 long rows sat there, orange and useless, and every man who drove past knew exactly what they had cost and exactly what they were worth, which was nothing at all. In July, Merle Dutcher sent a postcard. It said, "Still $6 a ton at my gate as a favor." Adeline put it in the drawer with the bank book, which was her way of saying something without saying it. The only man in Tolliver County who looked at those rows and saw anything but a mistake was Sig Vollmer. Sig was 74, retired, 2 rooms over the feed store, one hand permanently curled from a wrench that got caught in a hoist in 1931. He stopped his car in the lane one evening in June, walked the rows for 20 minutes without saying a word, and then told Emmett what he had bought. That span was raised in the fall of 1908 by the Vandalia Bridge and Ironworks, a pin connected through truss 80 feet. And Sig knew it because he had been 20 years old and on the erection gang that put it up. He could still name the members by the shop letters stamped in their webs. He said the iron in it was better than anything a mill would sell you now, and then he said the sentence that this whole story turns on, and neither man understood it at the time. There isn't any more of that iron. Not anywhere. They quit making it before the war, and nobody has made it since. Emmett heard an old man being sentimental about rivets. He said, "Well, Sig, you can have all of it you can carry." Now I have to tell you about the rest of the world in the summer of 1962, because that is the half of this story that was already moving before Emmett ever raised his hand. The testing had started again. After 3 quiet years, the big shots went off over the Arctic in the fall of 1961, the largest anybody had ever fired, and 1962 was heavier still, and what goes up in that kind of quantity comes down everywhere, thin and even and invisible in the rain. In a dairy state it comes down on grass. A cow eats 40 pounds of grass a day and turns it into milk in about 3 days. And that is why the milk of a dairy county became, in those years, the most carefully measured liquid in America. Which is how Dr. Margaret Ostrander, 34 years old, of the State Health Laboratory 130 miles away, came to be standing on the loading dock of the Wexford Mills Creamery on the first Tuesday of every month with a case of quart bottles, drawing a sample out of the weigh tank. Her problem was not getting the milk. Her problem was hearing it. Measuring something that faint means putting the sample inside a counting chamber, and the chamber has to be quieter than the thing you are listening for. Some of the noise comes out of the sky, and you stop that with mass, with iron, thick and dense walls of it. But here is the part nobody outside that trade knew in 1962, and it is the hinge of everything that follows. Every furnace in the country makes steel by blowing air through molten metal, thousands of tons of air per heat, and the air itself since 1945 has been carrying the dust of every test ever fired. That dust goes into the steel and stays there. Not much. A whisper. But if you build a quiet room out of steel rolled last year, you have built a room that hums, and the hum is louder than the milk. So a laboratory that wants a silent shield cannot buy one. It has to find iron smelted before 1945 and haul it home. The usual answer was shipplate-off vessels built before the war, and by 1962 every ton of it was spoken for. Ostrander and her instrument man had been at it for 2 years. The nearest 14 tons anybody would actually sell them sat on the Atlantic coast at $200 a ton. With freight on top, that more than doubled it, and the laboratory's entire equipment appropriation for the year was $6,500. On the last day of August, she stood at the counter of the feed store in Wexford Mills and asked the manager, mostly out of tiredness, whether anyone in the county had old iron for sale. Heavy, old iron. Pre-war, Sig Vollmer was sitting by the window with a bottle of orange soda. "There's 30 tons of 1908 iron laying in Emmett Sill's lot," he said, and he'd be glad to see the back of it. They came out on the 6th of September, Ostrander in the green sedan, and Ansel Kirk, the laboratory's instrument builder, 60 years old, with a counting probe and a meter in a leather case on the seat beside him. Emmett walked them down the rows. Kirk did not say much. He switched the meter on at the gate to hear what the day sounded like, and then he went along the first row with the probe held against the metal, and the needle came up off the pin and stayed there. He tried the second row. Same. The end posts, the top chord pieces, the floor beams. Same. It's warm, Kirk said. It's warmer than my truck. It's warmer than the road. Emmett said the only thing a man can say to that, which was that the iron had been sitting in a field since 1948 and had not been anywhere near anything. Then Sig, who had come along because he could not stay away, gave them the second piece of bad news honestly and immediately, because he was that kind of man. In 1950, the county rebuilt the floor system of that span. A truck hauling pulpwood had gone through the deck and bent it, and they had put in new stringers, new floor beams, and 2 replacement members in the lower chord. New meant 1950. New meant after the war. And Emmett had spent 7 weeks torching every connection in that bridge apart. So the 1950 steel was now lying in the same 3 rows as the 1908 iron, with nothing to tell them apart. Ostrander wrote it down in a notebook and then said the honest thing, which was that they could not use iron they could not vouch for, and that she was sorry to have taken his afternoon. The green sedan went back up the lane at 4 o'clock. Tolliver County had the story by Friday, and Tolliver County improved it. By the middle of the month, Emmett Sill had not merely bought a bridge. He had bought a radioactive bridge, and Merle Dutcher drove out from Rennick on a Sunday to say those 2 words in the lane where 4 neighbors could hear him, and to lower his standing offer to $4 a ton on account of the risk. That was the low place. There was a note at the bank that came due in November. There were 3 rows of iron in the lot that were now not even scrap. And Adeline stopped mentioning the bridge at all, which was worse than the drawer. The turn came on the last Saturday of September, and it came out of the smallest thing in this whole story. He had finally given up on the laboratory and gone back to the crossing. He set one of the 24-foot floor beams on blocks, wire-wheeled a bright spot on the web to strike an arc for a weld, and stopped with the grinder still spinning in his hand, looking at what he had just uncovered. A patch of metal, silver and clean, under 1/8 of an inch of rust scale, layered and flaking, like a scab you could lift off in plates. And he thought about where Ansel Kirk had put that probe. Every single time, flat against the rust. 14 years that iron had lain in an open pasture with the sky over it. 14 years of rain coming down through the 2 heaviest testing years in the history of the world, and every drop of it landing on rust scale, which is not a skin. Rust is a sponge. It is porous and hungry, and it holds whatever the rain brings. The iron was not warm. The coat the iron was wearing was warm. He ground 1 40-pound piece of the top chord to bright metal on both faces, brushed it, wrapped it in a clean feed sack, put it in the truck bed, and drove 130 miles on the Sunday, and on Monday morning he stood in a hallway at the State Health Laboratory with his hat in his hands, asking a receptionist for a woman whose name he had written on the back of Dutcher's postcard. Margaret Ostrander did not laugh at him. She took the piece down to Kirk, and Kirk put it under the probe, and the meter did not move. He did not believe it. He ran a longer count, 10 minutes, then an hour, with the iron sitting inside the miserable little shield they had. It stayed quiet. It was the quietest piece of metal that had come through that building in 2 years. Then Kirk, who had been in that trade since before the war and had a bad feeling, picked up the feed sack Emmett had wrapped it in and counted the sack. The sack was warm. That was the whole answer. Right there on a bench in front of the 3 of them, an empty feed sack, warm because it had touched the outside of the iron, and 40 pounds of 1908 chord metal. Silent, because nothing that ever came out of the sky had gotten past the rust. Ostrander came back to Tolliver County on the Wednesday with a purchase order, a set of conditions, and a chemist's precision about all of them. Every piece to be blasted to bright metal, all scale and paint removed, and every piece certified as original 1908 fabric. No 1950 steel at any price, in any quantity. The second condition looked impossible for about 10 minutes, until Sig Vollmer walked the rows again and solved it with his hands in his pockets. In 1908, they riveted. In 1950, nobody riveted anything. The rebuild was welded and bolted, because that is what a county crew in 1950 owned. So every piece that carried a driven rivet head, or the burned-off stub of one, or the punched hole a rivet had lived in for 42 years, was original. Every piece with a well bead or a machined bolt hole was not. And where a member was so cut about that neither test worked, there were the shop letters rolled into the web at the mill. Sig could read them, and he had spent the summer of 1908 handing those exact members to men on planks over the water. They sorted for 11 days. When they finished, there were 19 tons of certified 1908 iron in one row and the rest in the other. Then came the part that made a farm lot look like a shipyard. A silo painter out of Rennick brought his sandblasting rig and ran it for 60 hours over 8 days, 3 men feeding it, sand hauled in by the truckload, and the iron came out from under 54 years of weather the color of a new nickel. They cut it into lengths on a bandsaw the laboratory sent up on a trailer, and then they trucked it 130 miles a load into the basement of a building where a concrete pad had been poured to carry the weight. They stacked it like brick. Walls 8 inches thick of solid iron, a chamber inside about 5 feet by 5 feet by 6.5 feet high, with a door of the same stacked iron hung on a rail that took 2 men to roll aside. 14 tons of it, all of it smelted in 1908, in a decade when the air over this planet had never carried anything but weather. The laboratory paid $310 a ton, delivered and blasted. That is $4,340 in 1962 to a man who had bought the whole thing for $45 and had been offered $6 a ton by the only professional in the county who had bothered to price it. A count is a patient business. You set the sample inside, you roll shut a door that weighs as much as a car, and then you wait, sometimes half a day, while the machine adds up events one at a time, and every bit of it depends on the room around it holding its tongue. The counting room went into service in November of 1962, and it was, by a distance, the quietest room in the state. Over the years that followed it, measured milk from more than 900 farms in 11 counties, month after month through the heaviest years. The numbers going into the reports that told the health department what was in the food supply, and eventually that it was going back down again. And in the very first month's run, in a rack of quart bottles from the creamery on the rail siding at Wexford Mills, there was milk from 41 cows that crossed Pigeon Creek twice a day on the far side of Tolliver County. His own herd, measured inside a wall made out of the bridge his neighbors had laughed at, by a machine that could only hear it because that iron had been poured 54 years before anybody thought to wonder what the air was made of. In the spring of 1963, he built his crossing. He built it out of the 1950 steel, the floor beams and stringers the laboratory would not have at any price, which were the only part of that bridge he had ever actually wanted. 24 feet, 2 concrete abutments, a plank deck he replaced twice. His herd walked it twice a day for 26 years, and it was still standing when he sold the farm. He never did get the last laugh he was entitled to. Merle never came back and never mentioned it again, and the men who had made the jokes mostly just quit making them, which in a farming county is as close to an apology as the weather gets. But there was a pale scrap of paper with 45 written on it in grease pencil, wired to the near-end post on the 12th of May, and Emmett had put it in his shirt pocket and found it later in the wash. It sat on the milkhouse window ledge all through the summer of the laughing. He tacked it up over the milkhouse door that winter where he could see it while he washed the cans, and it was still there when the farm changed hands. 200 people stood in a wet pasture and looked at 80 feet of rusted iron and priced it at less than the cost of hauling it away. 3 professional dealers looked at it and passed. A whole county laughed for 5 months, and what it was 30 tons of the last clean thing in the world, metal made in a year when the sky was still empty, sitting in the grass with a $45 tag on it, worth nothing to anyone who wanted iron and everything to the only people alive who needed silence. Sig Vollmer was right the first time in June, standing in the lot with his hands in his pockets, and he did not even know how right he was. There isn't any more of that iron. Not anywhere.